Hearty welcome to this the second of this provocative and engaging series featuring scholars from around the world on topics relevant to our Jewish community. My name is Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen, and I'm the very proud rabbi of this wonderful congregation. Today's program, we're proud to present in conjunction with our community partners, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UTD and the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. What an honor it is to partner with you. We're also indebted to our brother, Dr. David Patterson, for making this series possible. God bless you. And what a wonderful lineup of scholars he lined up for us. As I said, this is the second. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Kenneth Price, who will speak on resilience in the face of catastrophe, a Holocaust story. There will be, by the way.
Uh-oh, you're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay.
Now you're okay.
Okay. Following the presentation, there'll be a Q&A, question and answer for questions. So please use the chat box and direct your questions to Congregation Nishmat Am. Congregation Nishmat Am. And Stanley Siegel will moderate the Q&A. Again, I say we are indebted of gratitude to our brother, Dr. David Patterson, for putting this magnificent series together. And we wish him a refuah shlema. Our guest, I didn't know if I was mute or not before, but again, our guest speaker today, we're proud to have with us Dr. Kenneth Price, who will speak on the topic of resilience in the face of catastrophe, a Holocaust story. A little bit about Dr. Price. Dr. Kenneth Price received his PhD in psychology from SUNY at Stony Brook, where he was a Herbert H. Lehman Fellow. He taught at Stony Brook, CW Post College, and was an assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at UT Southwestern Medical School.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, but someone.
Okay. He is the author. He is the author of some 24 academic articles in psychology and medical journals. He has served as an expert in over 40 legal cases and has evaluated over 300 military veterans suffering from psychological injuries. He is the author of the newly published personal historical memoir of the Holocaust, Separated Together. Separated Together. Okay, my friends, above all, Dr. Price is a real mensch and a very, very good friend. So it gives me a great pleasure to present to you for this lecture, Dr. Kenneth Price.
So are we ready to go? Okay. So thank you very much for that too kind introduction. So let's go right in. In recent years, attention has begun to turn to survivors who show few to no signs of post-war anger, depression, hostility, terror, nightmares, irritability, or isolation. Many of the new memoirs of Holocaust survivors are being written by survivors' children, in some cases grandchildren, and in at least one case, a son-in-law. Now, survivors have every right to be angry, cranky, fearful, and so on. It's certainly entirely normal to experience many of these symptoms following trauma. It is understandable, typical, and normal to have psychological symptoms following severe trauma. What is extraordinary is how so many survivors did not develop PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, but lived lives of happiness and joy, if not adventure. How extraordinary. Anne Weiss, the author of the Lost album, Eyes from the Ashes of Auschwitz-Birkenau, tells me that she belongs to a group of authors and mental health researchers in Philadelphia who are studying resilience in survivors and its positive influence on survivors' children and grandchildren. Today, I will give a brief overview of Sonja and Abe's lives and experiences before the war, during the war, and after the war, and how, in my opinion, Sonja and Abe are a case study in resilience, long-term happiness, and satisfaction with their lives. Stan, if you can give us the first photo, please. So the heroine of our story is Sonja Yaglom. Born in 1911, Sonja traced her ancestry back to her 18th century progenitor, Baruch Avraham, who was the first to take the family name Yaglom, which means diamonds in modern Hebrew. She was born in Brest-Litovsk, but when she was 3, the family moved to Pruzhina. On her mother's maternal side, she was descended from Rabbi Dov Berish Meisels, who was the chief rabbi of Warsaw and fought with Polish patriots in the rebellion against Russian occupation and rule in the 1860s. Sonja spoke Russian, Yiddish, and Polish fluently and learned Hebrew from a tutor who came to her house. Unlike his well-to-do brothers, her father, Isaac Mordechai, made a middle-class life for the family. Her 2 older half-brothers immigrated to the United States in 1912. Her older brother, Miron, immigrated to Argentina, and Mordechai himself emigrated from Poland to New York in 1928. If you go ahead, show us the next slide. And he left behind Sonja and her 2 sisters. That's Sonja in the front row sitting down, and Rochelle and Manya, her 2 sisters, are on either side of her. The person in the back is not his sister, that is the brother, Miron. And if we can go to the next picture, he left behind the girls and his wife, Golda. Golda suffered from anemia, and Sonja was the child who cared for her, often bedridden mother. Sonja and the family lived in the countryside, surrounded by ducks, chickens, and of all things, a cow. Sonja recalled only one incident of anti-Semitism growing up. A high school teacher asked the Jews in her class to move to separate seats away from the other non-Jewish Polish students. The teacher's order was countermanded by the principal when the Jewish students marched to his office to complain. Next slide, please. Now, the hero of our story is Abe Huberman, born in 1904 in a small Polish town, Kozienice, a Hasidic center and a center of shoe manufacturers. It wasn't until 1931 that electricity made its appearance in Kozienice. Abe's father, David, barely made a living as a shoemaker, and Abe's mother, Rivka, worked as a dressmaker. They both lived and worked from home, living in a 1-room apartment in a building of 4 apartments. The family was so poor that Abe would often go to bed early at night to try to avoid his feelings of hunger pangs. Little brother Aaron, recalled Abe, always hoped for a whole piece of bread instead of one of the little pieces that David would parcel out to the family. Once while visiting Aunt Paula, Aaron saw her give her dog, named Brillish, bones from the dinner with plenty of meat still on it. He whispered to Abe, "I wish I could be a dog in Auntie's house." At age 11, Abe dropped out of Cheder, his Jewish school, so he could help support the family, as his father David had just gone bankrupt. In spite of material poverty, the family was rich in love. In spite of the hunger in his childhood, Abe was emotionally well-nourished. The respect and love within the home helped form Abe's character: self-confident, secure, and optimistic, as much as his hunger shaped his ambition. By the middle teens, Abe was running the family shoe business, while David, his father, worked for him. By age 25, Abe was living in Warsaw and employing over 300 workmen who were fabricating and selling shoes. Warsaw is a long way from Kozienice, where the little boy had gone to bed hungry and slept with his father and brother in the same bed on an uncomfortable straw mattress. Sonja graduated from her gymnasium and moved to Warsaw to study at a teacher's college, something rather unusual for women in those days. Abe's sister Tovalea introduced Abe to Sonja. Abe fell in love with Sonja at first sight. After the first date, Abe told his mother that Sonja was the most beautiful and elegant woman he had ever met, and he was going to marry her. Later, when Sonja's mother asked her why she had decided to marry Abe, Sonja replied, "I have watched the way he treats his mother. Any man who treats his mother with such kindness and respect is certain to be a wonderful husband." If you go to the next slide, please. We have a picture of, there we go, a picture of Abe and Sonja at their wedding in March 1935. And we can go to the next slide. They honeymooned in Otwock, a town in the countryside known for its spa. Abe had cut his hair short, thinking that it would help a bigger head of hair grow. Sonja was not pleased at the time. The following December, their son David, or Dajo in Polish, was born, and 3 years later, their daughter Lucia. The 4 years that followed were good for Abe and Sonja. The business boomed. Let's go to the next slide. Abe invested his profits in real estate. He constructed a 6-story apartment building on 74 Zalazna Street, the bottom floor for retail stores, and the top 5 floors for residential apartments. We can go to the next slide also. And one more. And let's go to the next one. He also bought land on 65 Novolipki Street and another lot on 36 Niska Street. Sonja quit her teaching job and stayed home to take care of the children. She was described by her niece Hanka as generous to a fault. "According to my mother," wrote Hanka, "Sonja used to support many needy families." Let's go to the next slide. Here are pictures of Sonja on the far left, Dajo in the middle, and 2 sisters, Manya and younger sister, Rochelle. And let's go to the next slide. There is Sonja with little Dajo in winter, dressed warmly. On the next slide. This is kind of ironic. It's Dajo dressed up and playing as, I think, a Polish policeman. And the next slide. And there he is sitting on Abe's automobile. And we go to the next slide. In the Polish winter, dressed up warmly. One more slide. And this was after Abe had left Poland to come to the United States, which we'll talk about in a minute. And one more slide. Thank you. In mid-July 1939, Sonja's cousin Zalman approached Abe to ask him to accompany him to New York City to see the World's Fair. He persuaded Abe to travel with him because, as he told Abe would be able to see Sonja's father, Isaac Mordechai, who was living in New York, other cousins as well, and maybe he could even do some business in America. Can you go back? Thank you. Abe persuaded the American vice consul to give him a tourist visa, and more importantly, convinced Sonja to give him her blessing. After all, Abe would be returning in mid-September and would only be gone 7 weeks. Little did Abe and Sonja know that the separation would not last 7 weeks. 7 years would pass until they saw each other again. Ann Weiss told me that the story of Abe and Sonja could also be called a tale of two cities, as we tell the story of Abe in New York City and Sonja in Warsaw. If we go to the next slide, this photo was taken late in 1939, I believe. Abe left in July. He arrived in New York on August 2nd and was due to return to Poland in the beginning of September. On September 1st, 1939, German Luftwaffe fighter planes and bombers began the schrecklich destruction of Polish cities and Polish military positions, while columns of Wehrmacht tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, and hundreds of thousands of horses crossed into Poland to attack Polish forces. The Fuhrer had made it clear that this was not to be an ordinary war for territory. This was to be a war, as historian Alexander Racino described it, a Volksstromkampf, an ethnic struggle. The Fuhrer made it clear to his general staff, this was to be a war of Zerschlagung, the smashing of Poland, the ruthless annihilation of Poland, Vernichtung Polens. After the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, the city's military commander, General von Neumann-Nurod, ordered all Jews to be concentrated in an area of the main Jewish neighborhoods. This resulted in the uprooting and resettlement of 250,000 people, half ethnic Poles who were required to evacuate the Jewish quarter, and the other half Jews who had to find new living accommodations in the Jewish quarter. Since 74 Zalazna was within the so-called Jewish quarter, Sonja did not have to move. We all know what happened in Warsaw, and especially in the new Jewish ghetto. If you look at this photo, you can see the youngster Lucia with that look on her face, and Dajo on the far right is sad. Abe is not there. Sonja's making an attempt at smiling, but we know that this is not going well and will not go well. On the back of this picture was a little note that Sonja wrote to Abe. He received this after the war broke out. Well, the postal system was still working before Germany and America went to war. And she wrote, "You can see us all together here, and now you don't have to worry about us." So Sonja was actually trying to comfort Abe when the war broke out. Jewish businesses were closed or handed over to German, or in some cases, Polish collaborators as trustees. Money and bank accounts were confiscated. Polish children were not allowed to attend school after 6th grade. Gestapo and other German police operatives possessed special search lists they had compiled, known as Sonderfahndungslisten, of Polish and Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors, teachers, journalists, politicians opposed to Nazism, communists, priests, and rabbis. Using these lists, they located and murdered those in the lists, eliminating the Polish intelligentsia that might have inspired or organized resistance against the Germans. From September 1st to the end of December 1939, approximately 50,000 souls, among them about 15% Jews, were murdered by SS Einsatzgruppen and the Volksdeutsch self-defense auxiliaries. When a brick wall was built around the Jewish ghetto, the ghetto was declared closed in mid-November 1940. Food was rationed. Ethnic Germans were allowed rations about equal to those of the occupying German forces. Polish civilians were allowed half of those rations, and the 400,000 Jews in the ghetto were allotted starvation rations, and the Germans charged inflated prices even for those. By July 1942, at least 100,000 Jews died from starvation or disease. Poles who wanted to help Jews risked their lives. German proclamation of October 15, 1941, announced by signs posted all over Warsaw, forbade Poles from assisting Jews by smuggling food into the ghetto or hiding Jews on pain of death. We know that at least 1,000 Poles in Warsaw alone were murdered by Nazi death squads after being discovered helping Jews in the ghetto or hiding on the Aryan side. Despite the danger, Sonja frequently took off her white armband emblazoned with the blue Magen David, which identified her as a Jew, and she snuck out of her apartment to find food for herself and the children. Slipping out of the ghetto was not only difficult, it was dangerous. Outside the ghetto, in the so-called Aryan side, thugs and blackmailers, known in Polish as szmalkowniki, lurked, hoping to catch a Jew from whom they could extort money and then turn them over to the police for a monetary reward. At one point, Sonja heard from a family member that a Jewish shtetl in the countryside was not occupied by Nazis and had plenty of food. Sonja succeeded in bribing one of the 3 guards at the ghetto gate to let her, without papers, leave the ghetto. Just outside the ghetto, she and the children mounted the horse-drawn carriage she had ordered. Calmly and authoritatively, she instructed the driver to go to the train station. The carriage hadn't gone more than a few dozen yards down the street and around a corner before 2 young Polish szmalkowniki, waiting outside the ghetto to pounce on people leaving the closed ghetto, jumped on the carriage and screamed at Sonja while the children looked on in terror. "We know you're Jewish. We saw you come from the ghetto. Give us all your money and your jewelry." "What?" exclaimed Sonja in her clearly educated and perfectly enunciated Polish. "I came to visit a Jewish friend who owes me money." Clearly surprised and irritated by Sonja's words, one of the thugs lifted up his hand as if to strike her, and with a raised voice demanded she give them money. Mustering up her courage, Sonja, sitting in a carriage in the middle of the street, who knows how far from the nearest Nazi patrol, now raised her voice and snapped at the thug who was clearly in charge. "No, why should I?" At this point, the driver of the carriage flicked his whip and the horses took off with a start, both thugs grabbing onto the carriage to avoid being thrown off. Sonja knew that the driver was not heading to the train station. He was heading to Gestapo headquarters. In a split second, Sonja thought to herself that the driver must be in on the mugging with the 2 thugs. Their plan must be to take her to Gestapo headquarters and turn her and her children in for the reward the Germans offered for Jews found outside the ghetto. Jews not wearing the required armband, or Jews hiding money or valuables. She imagined that the 2 thugs planned to split the money with the driver. When Sonja recounted this story to us, She smiled and let out a little laugh. And she said, I really don't know what got into me. Without any thought, I jumped up and started shouting at the top of my lungs, Policia, Policia. I was practically jumping up and down, holding onto the carriage for dear life, swiveling my head here and there, as if looking for a police car to come roaring down the road to my rescue. At that, their faces red, eyes bulging in terror, the two Schmalkovniki jumped off the wagon, legs pumping, their jackets slapping behind them. The two thugs ran off, unlike Lot's wife, without so much as a glance behind. The driver now looked at Sonja with astonishment. Who is this woman? He must have thought, is she the wife of some Polish Nazi, and is she going to denounce me to the police? Sonja stared at the driver with fire in her eyes, extended her right arm, and pointed her finger directly at him. It must have been no further than a foot or so from his face. Now you take me to the train station this minute, she exclaimed with authority. And I mean now. The driver whipped the horse as if it were the one threatening him. Turning the carriage around, he drove Sonja and the children to the train station post haste. She arrived in time to board the train, not even a minute late. Jews were not allowed to travel on the trains anymore, but Sonja was traveling as a non-Jewish Pole, and dangerously without any identity papers. I asked her, how did it occur to you to do something so brilliant and dangerous? I don't know, she said. I had two little children whom I needed to protect and feed. We had to get out of the ghetto. I didn't think about it, I just acted. Do you know what the Nazis would have done had a police van actually shown up to see what all the commotion was about? And if they had discovered I had no papers? Or if the driver had suspected my ruse and driven us to the Gestapo? Do you know what they would have done to us, to me, and to the children? Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Abe woke up in New York on September 1st, 1939, and learned about the Nazi assault on Poland. Agitated, he read every Yiddish newspaper he could find and asked his family for translations of the radio news. With the help of Sonja's cousin, Sonja Yaglom, Abe produced an affidavit that he sent to the American vice consul in Warsaw, perhaps the same man who had given Abe the visa 2 months before, requesting the vice consul to issue a visa to Sonja and the children to travel to the United States. Alas, the vice consul ignored the affidavit, and a visa that would have saved all of them was never issued. Not only was Abe agitated with worry over his family's fate in German-occupied Warsaw, but his bank accounts in Warsaw were now frozen. And by October 1939, his money was gone. Abe's aunt and uncle took him into their one-bedroom apartment, which already housed 5 family members. Echoing his childhood, Abe was now sleeping with Uncle Jacob in Jacob's bed in the one bedroom. Recalled Abe, do you know how I felt without money, eating and sleeping with my uncle, crying during the night in the dark, swallowing my tears and worrying about my family? I came to visit the World's Fair as a millionaire, but I lived like a beggar. Let's go to the next picture, please. Abe had arrived on America's shores on August 2nd, 1939. He would become a naturalized American citizen on April 26, 1948. Between those years, he went to night school at Public School 98 and was elected president of the 40,000 night school student body. He won academic awards and was invited to be the keynote speaker at his night school's reunion. He bought war bonds and even appeared on the radio to encourage listeners to buy war bonds. Abe, of course, had to find a way to make a living. He started a business going door to door selling supplies to shoemakers. By the time he was reunited with Sonja, he owned a successful store where shoemakers came to him to buy product. In 1942, so many police officers in New York City had been drafted or volunteered for the service that there weren't enough officers on the streets. So Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia created the New York City Civil Patrol, an organization of uniformed men to replace the many police officers who were no longer able to walk the streets. Abe is sitting in the 5th row, 4th from the left. And you will notice that the force is also, wasn't just men, there were also women, and the force was also integrated. Going back to Warsaw, Sonja survived the Great Deportation in 1942 and the Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. The bunker in which she and others were hiding was discovered. Sonja with the children, Dajo and Lucia, and her sister Rochelle, along with others, were packed into a boxcar and sent to Majdanek. Many of the Jews who were discovered were sent to Treblinka. Why Sonja was sent to Majdanek, I do not know. Once arriving in Majdanek, she and the others were put to useless, backbreaking work, carrying stones from one side of the camp to the other, and then back again. Work designed to break the spirit as well as the body. After about 2 weeks, Sonja and the other mothers in Compound 5 barracks came back from heavy labor and discovered all the children were missing. Sonja recalled, they took away all the mothers and the children. 1,000 people in one time they took to the crematoria. You can't imagine what I went through then. I wanted to die. I asked the guard commander to send me where my children were. The guard pointed to the smoke rising from the crematorium, hit me with a club, and said with a sadistic smirk, "You'll join them soon, but you are young and healthy. First, you must work for the Reich." And here began my hell, wrote Sonja. I remained without my children and only thought about death. Sonja couldn't bear remaining in Majdanek after the loss of her children. Next slide, please. So when she had an opportunity on June 23rd, 1943, for transfer to a camp known as Auschwitz, volunteering to transfer to Auschwitz rather than remaining in Majdanek would ultimately save Sonja's life. Having secreted a gold coin, Rochelle and Sonja succeeded in bribing a capo to get a job in Canada, which is what the prisoners call the place where prisoners would go through the belongings of deportees. It was called Canada because they imagined that Canada, with its wide open spaces, was what they considered this job. And the job she was given was in the shoe commando. Her job was to tear apart shoes, looking for valuables, and to put the shoes in special bins where they could be repaired and sent to German civilians or used in the military. It was an indoor job which protected them from the cold Polish winters. Sonja survived starvation and typhus, and by miracle got her number off the death list. Every day, Sonja wrote, was another nightmare. It's hard to imagine that people can survive such torture, she wrote. But my instinct for life was strong. Sonja survived the January 1945 death march out of Auschwitz, followed by 3 weeks in Ravensbrück, and nearly 3 months slave labor in an aircraft factory in Neustadt Glewe, where she and Rochelle were liberated by Red Army troops on May 2nd, 1945. She weighed somewhere between 80 and 90 pounds. We can go to the next slide, please. After recovering in the hospital, Sonja and Rachel were hosted in a private home by a childless couple, the Blumenfelds. And here you see the Blumenfelds, Mrs. Blumenfeld on the far left, Mr. Blumenfeld in the middle, and Sonja, who looks like she's put back all the weight she had lost, on the far right. Next slide, please. Sonja and Rochelle have recovered. This is what they look like when they were walking in Belgium after recovery. Abe still didn't know that they were alive, and his relatives and friends were saying to him, Abe, get used to it, your wife is dead. It's already June and you haven't heard from her, forget about it, it's over. But Abe would say, no, I know she's alive. And he never gave up hope. Let's go to the next slide. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which in those years actually helped Jewish refugees, put an ad in a New York Jewish German language newspaper on June 8th, 1945. One of Abe's customers who subscribed to the newspaper brought the ad into Abe's store and asked if this was his family looking for an Abraham Huberman. Abe took one look at the ad. There is, of course, one minor error. Rachel was not Rachel Huberman. It was Rochelle, Sonja's younger sister, whose last name, of course, was Yaglom in Brussels. So Abraham Huberman of the Bronx is being sought by Sonja and Rochelle, Brussels. And the headline, of course, is Personen in Europa suchen, people in Europe are searching for. And it was common for months, if not a year or two, for these ads to be placed in various newspapers, allowing for the reunion of survivors with their families. Sonja knew that Abe was in the Bronx, but she didn't know his exact address. We can only imagine Abe's reaction when he saw this ad and learned that Sonja was indeed alive. If we can go to the next slide, please. Sonja wrote a long letter to Abe in Yiddish about her experiences. The letter was so moving that Abe brought the letter to the Yiddish language newspaper Der Tag, The Day, which published it on December 31st, 1945. In the letter, she wrote about death all around her. But she wrote, when she thought about suicide, Rochelle would remonstrate with her and say, "Sister, you have to live for your husband." And that, she wrote, is what saved me from death. Hoping that she would survive and be reunited with Abe after the war would end, Sonja always said, was what kept her alive. And believing with his deepest feeling that Sonja would survive. Abe said he didn't know if the children would survive, but he never, ever gave up the hope and the belief that Sonja would survive, allowed Abe to start working again from the bottom so that he could prepare a life for Sonja when they would be reunited. Next page, please. So Abe sent money to Sonja. He was able to wire money. He sent packages of food. And Sonja, it took almost a year for Sonja to get a visa, allowing her to come to the United States. By this time, Abe had learned how to get an affidavit by going to Congressman Bloom and giving him a nice a nice donation. He was able to get the affidavit. And on April 29th, 1946, Sonja arrived with only 10 other passengers in a converted Liberty ship to Charleston, South Carolina, where she and Abe were finally reunited. Here are Sonja with her girlfriends, and that's her sister Rochelle on the far left, in front of the ship, the Liberty ship that would take her to the United States. Interestingly enough, I discovered the ship's manifest on Ancestry.com, and I found that Sonja had listed her last permanent address as Auschwitz. That was her last permanent address in Europe. Sonja and Abe made a life for themselves on Long Island and were blessed with the arrival of two children, Mark and Gloria, and later grandchildren. Next slide, please. In 1951, at Sonja's urging, Abe closed his shoe supply business and learned the diamond business from one of Sonja's cousins. With his profits, he invested in what? In real estate on Staten Island. Abe and Sonja devoted the rest of their lives to their family, their synagogues, and their charities. Let's go to the next slide, please. You recognize the woman seated in the middle in the first row is Eleanor Roosevelt. Abe is standing on the far right. Sonja and Abe were always involved in raising money for various Jewish organizations, as well as contributing to American charities. They vacationed in upstate New York and Europe, although they never returned to Poland. They visited family in Israel and South America. They loved their grandchildren, and their grandchildren adored them. Well, I have no doubt that Sonja remembered many details of her 7 years of suffering. She was not obsessed with them. Common threads reported among survivors is that besides chance, of course, having family, friends, or social support in ghettos, camps, or forests helped keep them alive. Those who were alone died alone. Viktor Frankl wrote many years ago that creating some meaning in suffering makes the suffering more bearable. Sonja testified that she and Rochelle helped each other in many ways. One of the most important, as I've mentioned, was giving Sonja hope that she'd be reunited with Abe and would reconstitute a family. Both Sonja and Abe reflected the characteristic of acceptance of tragedy and hope for the future. Winston Churchill once said, "Life can either be accepted or changed. If it is not accepted, it must be changed. If it cannot be changed, then it must be accepted." Sonja and Abe lived their lives without regrets and with purpose for the future. Both Abe and Sonja were quite flexible in adapting to their lifetime changes. Both of them rose to the occasions in which they found themselves and adapted to their new environment. If you allow me to quote Winston Churchill again, Winston Churchill wrote, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." Now, one of Abe Huberman's favorite expressions was "Gam zu l'tova." This too is for the best. Had Abe not been stranded in New York and remained in Warsaw, he almost certainly would have been killed with the rest of the men in the family. Had Sonja not volunteered to transfer from Majdanek to Auschwitz, she would have been killed at the latest, had she survived, in November 1943, when the Nazis murdered 42,000 Jews still alive in Majdanek and surrounding camps in an operation they called Ernstfest, or Harvest Festival. 42,000 in 2 days. What Sonja always said kept her from total despair and suicide was the knowledge that Abe was alive in New York and would somehow make a life for them after the war. Let's go to the next slide, please. Two of the most important characteristics they shared were action and acceptance. Abe used to repeat one of his favorite sayings: "There are 3 days, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Yesterday is a lost day. It's like a canceled check. It is gone. It is worthless. Tomorrow doesn't belong to you. You can plan, but who knows? It's like a promissory note. Maybe it will be paid, maybe not. But today is important," Abe would say. "Today is like you're holding cash in your hand. Don't waste it. Use it well. You can do wonderful things with it. Take advantage of today. Help somebody else. Take good care of it, because today belongs to you." Abe and Sonja survived because of their commitment and love for each other and their courage in the face of catastrophe. They both actively refused to give up hope. Abe refused to fail in America, and Sonja refused to die. After the war, Abe and Sonja revived their pre-war, life-affirming, optimistic, and happy outlook on life. They refused to live in a past of sadness and grief. They lived in a future of hope and joy. In an essay Sonja wrote in 1948 for a night school assignment to write about her life, she concluded with the following stunning words that reveal her resilience far, far better than I can explain. In that essay, she wrote, "I was happy I had the children until 1943. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ken, for that moving and heart-penetrating portrait of two extraordinary people. You've touched the lives of everybody present, and we appreciate it greatly, having learned so much about them. We have a few moments if there are any questions. I'm looking in the chat room. comments. Beautiful. Amazing.
And I'm in the middle of reading your book, and I have to commend you for the scholarly style. In some ways, the writing reminds me of David McDonough, who's a historian that I like. And but I really think in terms of the detail, the way you wrote it, it's very moving and very inspiring. And I think congratulations on writing this book. I know it's been years in the making. And, I'm very proud of you. Yeah, since you're my cousin, I'm very proud of you, but I'm thrilled to be reading the book. And it's really a wonderful story.
There is a question from Janine Pullman. What happened to Rachel? Ken?
Oh, that's a good question. Rochelle survived along with Sonja, and she met a German Jew who had also survived, who also had an amazing story. He survived the war living in Berlin. And it's a long story, which we don't have time to get into today. But met Henry Hans, changed his name to Henry in America, was a polyglot. He knew French, German, English, I don't know what other languages. And he was saved by a woman who was the secretary to a committee or an organization in Germany that was called the Bureau for the Perfection of the German Language, of Purification, Bureau for the Purification of the German Language. And if the Gestapo fellow who was in charge of that bureau had known that the Jew, Hans Lachs, was working in the office, he would have been astounded. And Henry lived in the basement, I believe, of the secretary in this bureau. So Sonja and Henry married, and it took them, I believe, another year. What, Gloria?
Rochelle.
I said Sonja. I'm sorry, Rochelle. Rochelle married Henry. It took another year before they were able to come to the United States. And Abe had prepared an apartment for them in the building where he and Sonja were living. And 6 months later, they arrived. They ultimately bought a house in Lido Beach, the same community where Sonja and Abe, Gloria and Mark lived. And they were very close. They had lunch together every day. I met Rochelle, who was a very, very lovely, gentle, sweet woman. And there were more adventures that Sonja and Rochelle had in Europe during the Shoah that I didn't feel we had enough time today to go into, but I talk about them in the book. And they lived happily ever after.
Here's another question. How can a therapist or even a sympathetic friend help another person adopt the life-affirming qualities that distinguish Abe and Sonja?
It's a wonderful question, and I don't have a wonderful answer for it. I think what's important is to enable people to talk. They have to speak and have an ear that can listen. I mean, for Sonja to be able to write, I was happy I had the children until 1943. I don't know how someone could have that attitude. It's just unbelievable. It's amazing. Abe and Sonja were both amazing people, and I regret I don't have a good psychological explanation. They had good childhoods. They had each other. They were smart. They were mature. They were brave. I don't know if I could have done what any of them did. I think you have to be a good listener.
And we have one comment from Bobby. Beautiful story of turning sadness into a beautiful life. Loved hearing about Gloria's parents. Your storytelling was heartfelt. Thank you, Kenny.
Can I ask a question without putting it in the chat?
Go ahead.
And thank you, Ken, for that terrific delivery. It's one thing to write as a historian, but of course we know that your family. And I was wondering, and you don't have to answer this if it's too personal, I was wondering what kind of emotional and personal roller coaster it was for you to spend the time developing the intimate familiarity that you did and what it was like for you to be a part of writing this.
It's a wonderful question. I spent 6 years from beginning to end writing the book. Although not long after meeting Gloria some 50 years ago and hearing her parents' story and then meeting her parents, I felt that someday I needed to write this story. It just took me like 45 years to do it. I loved Gloria's parents like my own parents, and I think they treated me like another one of their children. They were wonderful, wonderful people. They raised 2 wonderful children. And I wrote the book both as an inspirational volume for people, as partly a historical book for people to learn what led to the Holocaust. And I was happy to show them as I saw them. Now people like to see books which show a change. They like to see books where the protagonists have all kinds of terrible qualities and they end up through some kind of event is changing total. Well, I couldn't do that because I couldn't think of a single negative quality that they had. I have to tell you, when I was writing about the children, it was actually very difficult for me because I have young grandchildren. And sitting at the computer at my desk, there were many times where I had to stop typing because the tears were coming down my cheeks. This is the worst thing in the world, to lose children. And how can you cope with the murder of your children and feel that you couldn't have protected them, and you yourself for being tortured and starved? I have so much respect for them. It was very emotional for me.
Thank you, Ken. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to bring the program to a conclusion, but may I ask for a few minutes before we leave? First of all, once again, thank you. My name is Stanley Siegel, and I am hosting this Zoom program on behalf of Congregation Nishmat Am. And on behalf of the congregation, we want to thank Kenny for a fascinating and deeply impactful presentation on the lives of 2 extraordinary people. We thank you. And we also want to, at this point, acknowledge Ken's wife, Gloria Price, whose family is the subject of this story. We want to thank our partners in today's program, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UT Dallas, the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. We're grateful to them for their participation in today's program and for the exceptional work they do day to day, year round, in Holocaust studies and furthering Holocaust awareness. A special thanks to Dr. David Patterson, who holds the Hillel Feinberg Distinguished Chair at the Ackerman Center, for organizing this program and planning the entire series. I'd like to call your attention to the series for just a moment, if I may, because after today, we have more lectures planned. Each presentation is a topic that is meaningful and relevant to Jewish life. It's called the Premier Speaker Series because these are programs that are of the highest caliber, as evidenced by Dr. Price's presentation today. We call your attention to the next program on Sunday, February 21st. That's going to be broadcast from Calcutta, featuring Dr. Navras Afridi. Please join us once again on the 21st at 11 a.m. and followed by presentations by Dr. Louis Cortez, Reed Heller, and Dr. David Patterson. Congregation Nishmat Am, while a relatively small synagogue, is huge in its spirit and in its programs. We're dedicated to providing a welcome, warm environment for people to come together for prayer and socialization, and at the same time offering educational programs that are open to all, programs that are relevant, programs that are mind expanding and of the highest order, with speakers who are clearly suitable to the task. We ask you all to help support the noble efforts of this congregation, to help with a donation to the synagogue, that even during this year of a difficult pandemic period, we have nonetheless maintained a high rate of programs, classes, services for our members, from people in the community, nationally and internationally as well. You have in front of you, below the list of the speakers, a phone number that you can call 24/7 to make a donation, our email address, and our website address as well. You'll learn about the many programs that are taking place. You'll get our mailings to learn about all the wonderful things that are taking place at Nishmat Am, not just the speaker series. And I also like to mention the special gala that we'll be having on May 2nd in honor of our beloved Rabbi Cohn, who introduced the program. You'll want to read more about that as well. So invite you all to participate. And once again, we want to thank you all for your support in advance. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming program and our speaker series. And once again, we want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Price, for all the work that you've done for this exceptional presentation. And we wish everybody a good afternoon. We will leave this screen up just for another minute. So if you wish, you can write down or take a photo of the contact information for Congregation Nishmat Am. Once again, thank you.
Dr. Price, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. It was really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kenny.
Thank you, Dr. Price.
Thank
It was
you
very
much.
inspiring.
קני היה מעניין מאוד, נהניתי מאוד. נשיקות, צריך תחזיק מעמד.
נשיקות לך גם כן. מדהים מאוד.
Beautiful, beautiful job.
Kenny, this is Yitz. I'd like to give you a hearty yeshikoach for a most inspirational, wonderful, and such a touching presentation. God bless you, and you and Gloria and your family have nothing but nachas.
Amen.
Amen.
What's your question?
Who's David?
No, that's Reed Heller.
That was who?
I'll answer
Reed Heller.
questions another time. Shalom u'leitzaot.
Amen. Leitzot. Yeshikoach, yeshikoach.
Tada.
God bless you.
He's such a great guy.
So he's like a professor at UT.
Kenny, it's Brenda. It was so beautiful, and I think more people should hear this talk. Many more people.
שלום, להתראות. התכתבתם מימין מסר.
Bye, good job.
Okay.